Good afternoon again. My name is Stu McKenzie. I am the Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, hosted here at George Mason University. We're very pleased to welcome you to this first talk in our spring series on transnational organized crime. As always, please do keep your microphones on mute to keep the background noise to a minimum for our speaker. If you do have a question during the talk, please use the chat box, and CINA's Director, Dr. Jim Jones, is kindly moderating a Q&A for us after the presentation's over. As we continue our spring series, please join us on March 17th when Dr. Diana Dolliver will discuss cryptocurrencies and criminal investigations, and also on April 14th for a talk by Mr. Jeffrey Hardy on illicit trade. To stay informed, please sign up for our mailing list. You'll also find details about upcoming events, as well as our research and much more on our website. This afternoon, I'm very pleased to welcome Celina Realuyo. Celina is a professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University. She's one of the foremost authorities, certainly no exaggeration, on a cluster of related issues, including U.S. national security, transnational organized crime, and threat finance. Her impressive career, frankly, defies summary in an introduction like this. It spanned public, private, and academic sectors. And some highlights have included serving as the State Department's Director of Counterterrorism Finance Programs, work as a private banker for Goldman Sachs, and a distinguished career as a U.S. Foreign Service officer. Celina's very kindly accepted our invitation to share some insights this afternoon into the current pandemic in a presentation entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on the Economy, Security, and Transnational Organized Crime in the Americas. Celina, always a great pleasure to host you. If you're ready, I'll hand off to you for your presentation.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Stu, and my colleagues at CINA for inviting me back, this time virtually. I wish I could be with you all in person. But this is life in the pandemic. And that's the topic that I've chosen today, is to take a look at the impact of COVID-19 in the Americas, especially on our neighbors to our south. And what I'll be taking a look at is what I call the dark side of globalization, and more importantly, how COVID-19 has served as a catalyst of that dark side of globalization. So this is actually a product of some research I've been doing over the past year, taking a look at the socioeconomic and then more importantly, the security and the impact on transnational organized crime in and of itself. What I try to do is give you a bit of a summary in a 30-minute presentation, and I really look forward to engaging with all of you in an active Q&A afterwards. So over the past decade, we have already seen the trends and sadly the impact that drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, and migration have had in Latin America, where we continue to see the highest rates of homicide per 100,000. What ended up happening in the past year is that the COVID-19 pandemic has actually aggravated a lot of these governance challenges as well as security challenges. And we're actually seeing the transnational criminal organizations adapt far quicker than the governments that are charged with countering them. So what we've been seeing, and at National Defense University, we've been actually analyzing this multifaceted impact that the pandemic has had and divided it into 4 categories. First, on public health, in terms of actual impact on our populations. The twin crises of a health crisis and a severe economic crisis that threatens the economic prosperity, not just here in our homeland, but across the world. And the implications on public security, which are now required to address the pandemic on top of their regular law and order responsibilities. And lastly, on democracy, on the way we've been able to not freely move about. And we've seen massive social protests that have arisen from various countries' lockdown policies. We'll take a look at each of these facets with much more detail. So as you know, we've been using the Johns Hopkins tracker, the dashboard, to monitor the propagation of the COVID-19 virus, which has now surpassed 100 million cases and over 2 million deaths. And here in the US, we monitor this every day, as you can imagine. It's a very useful tool if you're looking specifically country by country. And it is now commonly the accepted kind of reference when we're taking a look at how the virus is actually now also mutating, which is very disturbing with the variants that are seem to be much more contagious, but not necessarily more lethal. In Latin America alone, we've seen over 13 million cases. We're now approaching about 400,000 deaths, but the most impacted countries are the largest ones and also the more developed ones. So it's Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. And they have each basically authored and implemented their own lockdown policies to mixed reviews in terms of their effectiveness. What we've seen is the way countries are actually addressing the COVID-19 pandemic is in the prevention. We all know about it in terms of social distancing, wearing a mask, hand hygiene, and then the question about testing. How do you test for if someone is positive or negative? And then therapeutics and vaccines. So we've seen these different stages or this cycle being administered by governments. But what's more increasingly disturbing is how we have noticed that mafias and cartels are trying to get involved in the COVID-19 pandemic by creating black markets for testing, cures, as well as now the race to access the vaccine. We've also seen this twin, the health plus the economic crisis that had been born of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had a basic paralysis of global trade, travel, and tourism. And this has particularly been hard felt in Latin America because they are so reliant on international trade and tourism. And just to give you an example of what the world is worried about, as you know, the World Economic Forum meets in January every year, normally in Davos, this year virtually, taking a look at what the impacts are going to be. And what they saw in this year's report was tremendous impacts on the economic side of the house and a prolonged recession. And Latin America is not immune to that. Just to show you some of the IMF projections of a GDP contraction last year of negative 8.1% and anticipating a very weak recovery in this year. And a major impact on the different economies who are extremely reliant on remittances is a decline of almost 20% in 2020. And as many of you know, especially the Central American countries are extremely dependent on remittances from overseas that comprise up to 20% of their GDP. Very sadly, all the gains, they're actually going to call this the lost decade, in the words of the former IDB President Moreno, that poverty levels are going to increase up to 37.2% in 2020, which means 230 million people are categorized as impoverished in the Americas, which is a very disturbing factor. Then lastly, because governments are spending, not to mention just not in the US and Europe, but all around the world to address the health as well as the economic crisis, they were already in poor shape fiscally prior to the pandemic. What we've also seen, whether it's in the United States or in the UK or Germany or throughout Latin America, is this tension between public health policies that recommend lockdowns versus the economy. And just to show you that the size of population that have been actually impacted by coronavirus lockdowns, it's all around the world. And sadly, we've seen how those lockdown policies, the reaction to them, have resulted in massive social protests during the pandemic. It's important for those who don't follow Latin America to know that even prior to the pandemic, there were huge protests in Chile and in Colombia that were already reflective of the social unrest and the grievances of the populations against the sitting governments. What we're also starting to see is that states risk the risk of alternative governance, a concept that my colleague Douglas Farah has written about extensively, where we actually have criminal gangs that are providing COVID-related services, such as assistance. They're the ones actually imposing the lockdowns and curfews. And here I chose a photo. These are care packages in Mexico that are being distributed by the Sinaloa cartel, with a little bit of marketing and branding. You'll see the photo of El Chapo Guzman, who's incarcerated here in the US, but his image is still quite popular there. And inside these boxes are like hand sanitizer, gloves, and masks. It's like a COVID kit that they're distributing to win the hearts and minds of the local populations. What we've also seen is a tremendous impact on public security. So not only do the security forces that include the armed services as well as the police have their regular duties of internal and external security, but they are now burdened with enforcing the curfews, the quarantines, as well as border security. Here I've chosen two photos of the hotel that we frequent when we're on TDY, the Sheraton in Lima, Peru. And right outside, you'll see the army actually imposing and, more importantly, maintaining the curfew. And then to your right, you'll see the border between Venezuela and Colombia, with the Colombian police preventing the migration of Venezuelan refugees into Colombian territory. What does this actually mean? So on top of the traditional roles that public security forces have, in terms of citizen security, border security, and regular humanitarian assistance, they now have to help with the pandemic-related policies. So they're the ones actually distributing PPE, ventilators, and they're the ones that are going to be organizing the vaccine rollouts in the different countries, similar to what we're having here in the US. What we've seen too is that the global illicit networks, that includes criminal groups, traffickers, terrorist groups, insurgents, have also been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. It's not that these activities have stopped, but it's very interesting to see how criminal organizations have quickly adapted to this new pandemic environment. We've actually seen how, since they've been so dependent on globalization, they had to adjust quickly when their global supply chains were cut in the initial months of the COVID lockdowns, and more importantly, the actual stoppages in terms of maritime and air travel that we were so accustomed to, that connected all of our countries and all of our markets. And we've also seen that there was a disruption in the initial stages of global drug trafficking as well as manufacture, despite this diversification of drugs. They've been very quick to resume, but more importantly, we're starting to see how they're evolving and adapting with an increasing reliance on cyberspace in order to market and then deliver and move the product, as well as the financing of the drug trade. We've also seen that because of the very strict border crossing policies, you've actually seen that migrants, whether they be from within the Americas or what has been termed special interest aliens by the Department of Homeland Security, who are people who are not of Latin American origin. They come from Asia or Africa or the Middle East. They're actually trapped in the countries where they found themselves, let's say in March of last year, once the borders were actually closed. And we've seen that what we're anticipating is going to be large movements once those border closures are lifted. We've also seen an impact on money laundering and terrorist financing methods, especially in what I call the physical realm, whether that's through bulk cash smuggling, of having mules physically crossing the border with large sums of cash, or the dependence on international trade through trade-based money laundering that actually is so reliant on globalization and large flows of legitimate commerce to disguise the origins of their proceeds. And then physically banks. What we've seen is much more activity in terms of mobile and then through the internet, and a huge explosion of the use of cryptocurrencies for the good and for the bad. But we're actually very interested in how criminal organizations are leveraging cyberspace to actually move their activities from the physical into the cyber realm. And that's what we're starting to really appreciate a year into the pandemic, is how the pandemic has served as a catalyst to expanding illicit markets and the illicit economy in the dark net, and then more importantly, the increasing use of cryptocurrency in order to push products such as opioids and fentanyl in particular. So what have we been observing is an adaptation by criminal organizations in this new COVID environment. Some of the crime is going from global to local. We're seeing this particularly in the case of Mexico. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, they're really getting into the business of medical supplies trafficking, whether that's PPE or contraband. There was a big scandal in New York about N95 masks that were actually not fit for the actual legitimate standards being peddled in the black markets. And now a lot of concern that the vaccines could be either diverted or, more importantly, counterfeit vaccines could actually enter the market, and not just in Latin America, but around the world. We've seen more interest and more activity in counterfeit goods as people have smaller and less disposable income. And I've already mentioned that cyber is really a new area of operation, with cybercrime and all types of kidnap for ransom and extortion and malware that's taking place in cyberspace. We've also seen higher levels and, more importantly, opportunities for corruption, and that presents a huge governance challenge, and the issue of high interest loans and loan sharking, as we term it. I made the mention already of the fear that in marginalized societies and marginalized communities, you can actually have alternative governance becoming the norm as gangs and cartels and mafias actually replace the actual elected governments in providing the basic services for a certain community. And what we're seeing, sadly, is there's more conflict and there's more violence. So despite all the very strict lockdown policies over the past year across Latin America, unfortunately, homicide rates remain at record highs. And this is care of our colleagues at Inside Crime, which is a very good resource that tracks every year the homicide rates in Latin America and the Caribbean. While in other parts of the world, violence and homicides have actually decreased because of the lockdown policies, in Latin America, it continued and actually got worse in certain areas. And it's very much linked to illicit trafficking of all different varieties. What we're worried about in the coming months is that once the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted, and once the economy goes back to whatever the new normal is going to be here in the United States, we're anticipating a huge surge of drug trafficking and migrant caravans heading northbound, since we are the consumer market for both. We've also seen that you've seen already massive caravans forming. There's another one that is forming again this week in Honduras, according to our Guatemalan contacts. And more importantly, this kind of push to get to the US as soon as possible because of the misinterpretation of the new administration's policies regarding migration. What we're seeing then too is tremendous pressure on our border that we've always had before, but there's a new wrinkle that we have to deal with. And this is the challenge that US-Mexican cooperation is going to be in the security realm. Many of you have followed the case of former Minister of Defense, Cienfuegos, who was arrested in Los Angeles International Airport in October on drug charges. And then after a 10-year investigation by the DEA and other agencies on the US side, and then for political reasons, he was returned to Mexico, and the Mexican government has decided not to press charges or investigate the allegations on the US side, and they actually published the affidavit in full and made that public. We anticipate a very challenging and, more importantly, a very conflictive relationship with our neighbor to the south in terms of security cooperation at a time where the threats are growing, whether it's drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, or migration patterns. And it's an interesting time that we have to start really focusing on where we can cooperate, and more importantly, what it would be a win-win for the AMLO and the Biden administrations. We're very worried about the consumption and demand for synthetic drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl and other opioids here in the US because of the mental health issues associated with the pandemic and the lockdowns will actually increase the demand on the US side, which the Mexican cartels are more than happy to supply on their side. So when we think about how we can better counter transnational criminal organizations in this new environment, we have to really focus on keeping the military and the police forces focused on transnational organized crime on top of their new missions related to the pandemic. We also have to better understand how these transnational criminal organizations are changing and adapting their modus operandi, and also try to anticipate where they're going to diversify their operations and their business lines. And this piece I talked about alternative governance, we really have to think about whether it's youth at risk or certain communities at risk that have been marginalized by central governments. We have to prevent them from being susceptible to being recruited or extorted by criminal elements in the different countries where this is a problem. And we have to reemphasize that no nation and no agency can work alone. Therefore, we really have to invest more in promoting interagency and international cooperation. And sharing information is so critical, especially as we understand the new methodologies and the new typologies of these groups as they adapt their businesses and their activities in the age of COVID-19. We've seen the multilateral organizations have and play their role, and the U.S. is continuing to support those as the #1 donor of the multilateral organizations. We've just rejoined the World Health Organization and have pledged tremendous economic and financial support through the international financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And then bilaterally and regionally, the U.S., through its different agencies like USAID and the military, are directly assisting Latin America and the Caribbean with the kind of challenges during the pandemic. This is the latest update from U.S. Southern Command based in Miami about how they are organizing and then deploying their humanitarian assistance programs. And a lot of it has to do with that cycle that I explained to you earlier of the prevention, the testing, the actual therapeutics, and the distribution of vaccine in terms of helping our partner nations deal with addressing and defeating the pandemic. So as we look kind of forward, we have to anticipate that this economic crisis, and sadly those who are going to fall into poverty, is going to be a long, much longer period than we anticipated. And this term about a lost decade for Latin America is sadly coming true. We're seeing tremendous numbers of young people who for the first time had access to education and were enrolled in universities actually leave. And that's an important aspect that we have to think about as this next generation has to take a look at not just the what we call the health recovery, but the economic recovery that's required to come back to prosperity and security. Then the second one is taking a look at how governments can finance their recovery policies and programs and avoid rampant corruption. There have already been tremendous cases of all types that are COVID related, whether that's the diversion of ventilators in certain South American countries that are sold in the black market, or actual scandals regarding COVID relief funding. It's a concern of Transparency International that corruption is actually going to be on the rise in the age of COVID. Then I already mentioned how security forces are going to have more missions and fewer resources. So we can be smarter about how those resources are allocated, and we cannot forget the mission to counter transnational criminal organizations. Then lastly, and sadly, we're already starting to see it, that we know that these criminal organizations are starting to adapt and diversify their activities and are becoming increasingly violent in order to capture new markets and new routes, and what they call in Mexico plazas, or marketplaces. These are the types of things that we need to prepare ourselves to anticipate, but more importantly, harness all of our resources at the national and then more importantly at the international level in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, security, and transnational organized crime in a way we can actually promote security and prosperity in the Western Hemisphere. And with that, there are my contact details, but I look forward to your conversations and then more importantly, creating a dialogue with you with some really interesting questions.